As a child, I was always very closely connected with bedtime stories. I used to read a lot of stories, and these stories were my best friend. And these stories helped me to ignite my imagination. It enabled me to build my own private world of fantasy and imagination. Those stories were actually really, really wonderful. It fascinated me as a child when I read through those various different stories like Cinderella, like Peter Pan, then Moby Dick, all these stories, Captain Hook, all these stories, it fascinated my mind. So basically, these childhood stories, it helps to dream about life through the eyes of fantasy and imagination, and these are the stories that teaches us about society. It teaches us about class. It teaches us about emotions. It also teaches us about relationships, values that are good and evil. So today, my dear children of class 7, we shall be dealing with a story containing such childhood stories. And it is a story that teaches us how important these childhood stories are and how important a role it plays in our life. And through it, we learn to keep a balance between imagination and reality. So today we shall be dealing with the story Educating Mother by Sauganti Krishnamachari. And this story is basically about a mother who is reading various different stories, who tries to read various different childhood stories to her children, but her children are opposed to all those stories that she reads, as they bear a very, very critical mind. They lacked imagination, because of which they fail to enjoy the stories that their mother is trying to read out to them. So now let us see what happens and what kind of conversation develops between the mother and her children, as these children overhear their mother reading all these stories to them. So now let's begin with the story. It all started when my mother asked me to tell the children a story. So the narrator out here is the mother of the children who will be reading out story to them. So it seems that her mother, the narrator's mother, who happens to be the grandmother of all those children, she insisted her daughter to read stories for her grandchildren. So this narrator, it all started when my mother asked me to tell the children a story. I cleared my throat and began, long, long ago. Then the minute she started her story, she had just begun the sentence, the first few words. And what happens? How long ago? Squeaked my three-year-old nephew Venku. Never mind, it was a long time ago. Let's go on with the story. So the minute she started, curious little Venku, her 3-year-old nephew, was inquisitive, was very curious and wanted to know how long ago. So he interrupts and asks her, how long ago did the story take place? When did the story take place? But she ignores it and she says, it was a long time ago. It was really a long time ago. Let us now move ahead with the story. Try telling. Then before she could even go ahead with the story, before the mother even could go ahead with the story, the narrator, she was again interrupted. Try telling my history teacher that, said my 12-year-old daughter Ambu. She insists that I get all the dates right in my history test. So she was very critical about the answer and the response that her mother gave to her brother, her cousin, Venku, 3-year-old Venku. For she was not satisfied, and she remarked saying that if you try telling that to my history teacher, not giving a precise date, then probably my history teacher would have punished you. My history teacher would not have accepted it. Then I decided to go ignore her. The narrator, that is the mother, she decided to ignore her. There was this girl called Goldilocks. So she was about to tell a story of Goldilocks and 3 bears. So there was this girl called Goldilocks. This is the first story that she reads out to her children. The names parents come up with, muttered Ambu in a complaining way. Thank God you didn't choose to call me Long Nose or Saucer Eyes. So see, basically Goldilocks was named Goldilocks in that story, in that fairy story. Goldilocks was named so because of her hair. Golden locks, that is the hair that was golden in color. She was a blonde. She had yellow hair, so that's why she was called as Goldilocks. And as soon as Ambu hears the name of Goldilocks, she becomes very critical of the name, and she says she does not allow her mother to go ahead with the story, and she keeps saying that what kind of a name her mother has kept for her, Goldilocks. She mocks at the name. And she says, thank God that my name was not kept as Long Nose or Saucer Eyes. So she starts becoming very critical about the name Goldilocks. As it is, she was critical about the time, and now she's being even more critical about the name of the character in that story, that is Goldilocks. And she seems not to be happy about, and she is relieved that her mother did not name her as Long Nose or Saucer Eyes, for Ambu did have long nose and round saucer-like eyes, Then see, Goldilocks decided to go for a long walk. I continued. So she continued, the mother, the narrator, she continues with the story. And then what happens? Did she have a weight problem? Asked my 4-year-old Ramu, who seemingly appeared curious for a greater insight in the story. No, she didn't. She went for a long walk and straight into the forest. Soon she discovered that she was lost. So Ramu was so curious that he asks, after hearing his mother say that Goldilocks had gone for a long walk into the forest, he quickly asks, Ramu, the 4-year-old Ramu, he quickly asks whether Goldilocks, the reason why Goldilocks had gone out for a walk was her weight problem. So he comes up with this strange idea and strange thought that probably Goldilocks was out because she had some weight problem. So these children were basically not at all, it seems we can clearly see that these children have a very critical mind that they carry, because of which they are not able to enjoy the story. They are not able to imagine it. That is exactly what we see out here. But yet the mother, she moves ahead with the story, and she says, no, she didn't. She went out for a long walk and straight into the forest. Soon she discovered that she was lost. If she had a cell phone, she could have called her mother, said my 6-year-old niece Janki with concern. Don't be stupid. They had no cell phone in those days, said Ambu. Oh, so it was that long ago, exclaimed Janki, as if the pre-cell phone era belonged to antediluvian days. So we see out here that these children weren't at all allowing their mother or the aunt to move ahead with the story. For any time she said something, she had to say something about the story, about Goldilocks in particular out here. Their critical thought always had some curious question in their mind. For example, this Janki, she says that, if she had a cell phone, then probably she wouldn't have been lost. And then comes Ambu in the middle, where she debates that this story happened such a long time ago that there wasn't any cell phone. No cell phone existed at that point of time. So all these things happen, but they do not. What we see is that these children were not allowing their mother to go ahead with the story in a very smooth manner. But yet this poor mother patiently goes ahead with the story and says, "The poor thing came to a cottage that belonged to the three bears. She was so hungry that she made straight for the dining room. There on a table were three cups of porridge. She had a sip from the father bear's cup. It was too hot. The mother bear's porridge was too cold. But the porridge in baby bear's cup was just right, so she drank the baby bear's porridge." So she goes ahead with the story of Goldilocks, of how she encounters the bear's house and how she enters the house of the bear, and how she, out of hunger, she tries to eat what was there laid on the table of the bear family, where she found 3 bowls of porridge, each belonging to the father bear, the mother bear, and the baby bear, and how eventually she lands up eating the entire bowl of baby bear's porridge. So then she moves ahead. Actually, I think Goldilocks is a murder mystery, and said Ambu in a tone with greater understanding of the story. Her reading consisted of a staple diet of thriller and romances, and her thoughts tended towards the macabre. This was too much even for me, indulgent mother though I was. A murder mystery? How can you be so stupid? So the minute she just completes saying about how Goldilocks enters the house of the bear and how she lands up eating the baby bear's entire porridge in the baby bear's bowl, Ambu again interrupts, and she doubts. She says that, she has a strong feeling that Goldilocks and the Three Bear is related to thriller. It's a story that deals with thriller and suspense. It's a mystery story. Why? Because Ambu was a girl who was very, very interested in stories that were related to suspense and mystery. So that is why she starts doubting that Goldilocks was a murder mystery. She does this without even listening to the entire story. She already has drawn a conclusion. And Mother, on the other hand, says, how can you be so stupid? Because Goldilocks and the Three Bear, this story is not a murder mystery. It's not a mystery. Then, well, how do we know it wasn't murder mystery? See, Ambu is still insistent that Goldilocks and the Three Bears is a murder mystery, and she debates. How do we know it wasn't murder mystery? I've only heard your version of it. How do I know you haven't edited out all the interesting bits simply because you don't approve of murder stories? I think Goldilocks was an heiress. The house in the forest belonged to the person who stood to inherit the property if she died. Seeing her go into the forest, he must have put a bowl of poisoned porridge in the cottage. She must have drunk the porridge and died. The bears were your invention. So, Ambu disapproves of the story that her mother read out to them. She feels, she doubts that her mother was trying to edit the real story. And what Ambu believes is the real story related to the Three Bear and Goldilocks is actually a murder mystery. And she starts imagining her own story, and she says that probably Goldilocks had been an heiress. Heiress is somebody who who would be inheriting a huge amount of wealth and property after her parents. So Ambu doubts that probably Goldilocks is an heiress. She is an heiress, and somebody wanted to kill her. And probably that person must have put poison in the porridge for her to drink so that she would die. And probably she must have, after having drunk the porridge, she must have died. This must be the real story. That is what Ambu believes. Ambu believes that this is the real story, and the story that her mother was telling her about how Goldilocks encounters the house of the bear is all false. a false story, or is all a made-up story. That is what Ambu believes, and she rejects the story being told by her mother. Then the little ones were drinking in her words with awe. So as Ambu debated and told her version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears being a murder mystery, the other children who were there who were intently listening to Ambu, they were intently listening to Ambu, and these children, they were also agreeing with what Ambu had to say. They were in fact more interested towards the version that Ambu had drawn rather than showing interest towards the version that their mother had been reading out to them. Then see, the little ones were drinking in her words with awe. Clearly, her version excited them more than mine did. Maybe Goldilocks was not the right choice. So finally, the mother decided that Goldilocks and the Three Bears is not a good choice of story to read out to my children. I think I must change the story. So this is what the narrator, she thinks. And she says, I would tell them some other story. I began the story of Red Riding Hood. So it seems that her decision to read the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears happened to be a total failure, for the children would never stop asking questions. They were so curious, and they were thinking and imagining about the story in such a critical manner. They had such critical thought that the mother failed to read out the story. It was a total failure for her, so she decided to switch over to another story, that is Red Riding Hood. Then Red Riding Hood took a basket full of cakes and went off to visit her grandmother, who lived all alone in the forest. Humans shouldn't encroach on forest land, said the environmentally conscious Janaki. Again, these children would not stop at all. The minute the mother started with another story, Little Red Riding Hood, and the minute she had just started off with the sentence, with the beginning of the story about how Little Red Riding Hood went on a visit to her grandmother who lived in the middle of the forest, this environmentally conscious niece, Janaki, she interrupts saying, humans shouldn't encroach the forest, Then see what happens. On the way, Red Riding Hood met a wolf and told it where she was going. The wolf took a shortcut to her grandmother's house and frightened off the old lady. The wolf then dressed in grandma's clothes. Presently, Red Riding Hood arrived. She looked at the wolf and said, "Grandma, why are your ears so big?" Ambu snorted. So the mother was telling the story, and so what happens? Ambu snorted in the middle of the story. She interrupts. She snorted. If one of us had mistaken a wolf for grandma, we would have been eaten by grandma, even if the wolf had spared us. So again, the critical Ambu, she interrupts saying that, she does not agree. She is in complete disagreement about how Little Red Riding foolishly mistakes the wolf disguised as her grandma. She mistakes that wolf as her grandma and is unable to see that it is not not her grandma who's there, but the wolf. And she says, and Ambu says, had I been in the place of Little Red Riding Hood, and had I mistaken my grandmother as a wolf, my grandmother would instead of the wolf, my grandmother herself would have eaten me alive. So she becomes very critical about this story once again. And then what happens is, see, Even the youngest was shaking his head in disbelief. Even the youngest, let alone the eldest, that is Ambu, she did not believe. Obviously, it's very natural. We can, in a way, consider that. But just imagine, even the youngest of the member who was seated out there and listening to the story, even the youngest was shaking his head in disbelief. He also did not believe the story that the mother was narrating. Grandmas don't look like wolves, do they? So he asks, how come a grandma looks like a wolf? Grandma can never look like a wolf, and how could she mistake the wolf as a grandma? That is what he also tries to ask. My mother was watching me carefully. So the children's grandmother who was there, she was also watching, she was looking at her daughter, that is the mother of Ambu. She was watching, she was looking at her very carefully. I could sense an air of hostility gathering against me. So what is this air of hostility? The air of hostility is the air of disagreement. Now tell me now, children, who out here is not in agreement to the stories that the mother is reading? Yes, the children who were there, who were seated around her, who were listening to her stories, were not at all in agreement to what she was reading. In fact, they were not at all even believing to the stories that she was reading out for them. So then what happens is, of course, grandmothers don't look like wolves. Forget Red Riding Hood. I'll tell you the story of Cinderella. Now she gives up again. The mother gives up the story of Little Red Riding Hood, and she decides to hop onto the next story, and that is the Cinderella story. Of course, grandmothers don't look like the wolves. Forget the Red Riding Hood. Let's forget about the story of Red Riding Hood. I'll tell you the story of Cinderella. And see what happens. Oh, mother, not that simpering idiot who waited all her life for Prince Charming to save her. She could have escaped her stepmother by getting herself a good education and job, said Ambu. To that also, Ambu had something to say, and in fact, before even the mother could begin the story, Ambu had already made up her mind about she had already thought about what the story was like. She already had created an idea, a thought about Cinderella. Ambu felt that Cinderella was a useless girl. She was so useless who waited her entire life to be saved by a Prince Charming instead Cinderella could have actually educated herself, got herself a good job, and then freed herself from her stepmother. Like any modern women would do. So that is what Ambu says, and she rejects the story of Cinderella once again out here. Then how could she have gone to school when she was made to do all the housework by her stepmother? I had her there. So the mother, she tries to overshadow Ambu by saying that how could Cinderella go to school during that time when she was completely shut within the four walls of the house and made to do all the household chores, all the household work by her stepmother? How could she educate herself? That's what her mother questions Ambu. Then Ambu says, she could have gone to night school. See, she always has a solution. She comes up with something or the other, which is very, very logical. Whatever Ambu and the rest of the children, we should note out here that whatever Ambu and the rest of the children, they say in response to the story that they hear, it is very, very right and very, very logical. That is there. But at the same time, we should not forget that the mother is actually reading a fairy tale, a story of fiction to them. And these children, instead of enjoying these stories, instead of enjoying the moment of hearing to the stories that their mother was reading out to them, instead of enjoying it, they land up becoming very, very critical minded. And then she says she would have gone to night schools. Anyway, mother, why are all the daft persons in your stories girls? Who wrote these stories with a gender bias? Ambu said indignantly. So Ambu was very, very angry, and now she comes up with another very logical thinking, another very critical thought that she comes up with. And this time she comes up with something very strong. She says, she challenges, she debates by asking, and she debates and asks her mother, questions her mother, that how could the writer possibly choose all those lead characters in these stories? How could he or she choose the lead character as a female? And that too, all these females, they happen to be somebody who is stupid, somebody who is very foolish. So in this manner, Ambu was being very, very critical about all those stories which she feel that it was not quite just, where all the lead characters in all those stories were female who were all very stupid. She did not like that idea at all. So in the sense that, why or only female? Why not male? Why not men? Men be projected as somebody stupid. That is what Ambu was trying to say out here. Then see, it was difficult enough trying to keep 3 children out of mischief by telling them stories. It didn't help if one had to be politically correct too. I had to think of a story where the protagonist was male and preferably daft, preferably stupid. So then this is what happens. Definitely we can see out here that it had become extremely very difficult for the mother to even complete a single story. In fact, she had not even completed a single story so far. Why? Because of the critical thinking of the children, which was very politically correct. If we have politically and logically, it was extremely very correct. They were right in their own ways, but yet, their logical thinking was making it very difficult for their mother to complete any of the stories. Then what happens? So she decides to plans on to tell a story where the protagonist is the lead character. So where the protagonist was a male. What about Jack and the Beanstalk? I've heard that one too, said Ramu. So it seems that the children have heard almost all the story. That's the one where Jack plants a seed and a very, very tall plant grows from it overnight. Did Jack use a genetically modified seed? Asked Janaki. So see, she has a very scientific thought. These people, they not just have logical, they just not just make logical thinking, not just have a critical mind, a mind where which thinks critically, but at the same time they think in scientific terms too. And she lands up asking, did Jack use a genetically modified seeds that made the plant overnight, in an overnight a tall tree grew out of that seeds? That's what Janaki asks. It was no use. It was no use for whom? It was pointless for whom? The mother. It was no use telling them all those stories. It was no use. I had to think of something else. The mother, now she's thinking to herself, it was no use for, no point telling them stories. So she had to think of something. What about the old story of Patala? Then, Patala Bhairavi, where a man wears magic slippers that takes him wherever he wants to go. How are those slippers propelled? Asked Venku with a scientific query. Propelled means to push or move something without a lot of force. So he asks, magic slipper? How come a magic slipper that made him fly? Did that slipper have something in it that propelled him to fly? So with a very scientific query,
Venku asks about the slipper. Then what kind of fuel did he use? Asked Venku with a similar inquisitiveness, with a similar curiosity. I fled. So eventually the mother, she fails to complete any of her story to her children. Why? Because the children, they carried a very critical mind. They thought about as they listened to all those stories, they were giving a very critical opinion of their own, and that actually failed the mother from completing any of her stories that she was planning on to read or to her children. So what happens is, mother failed as the children rejected the stories, as they listened to each of those stories through their critical thinking. So what we see out here of the children is that these children, they lacked imagination. They were unable to build any emotional bonding. They were not able to actually connect with the story. So what happens is, Albert Einstein once said that if you allow your children to, if you want your children to be intelligent, you will have to read them fairy tales. And if you want your children to be more intelligent, read more fairy tales. So, why? Because such fairy tales, it helps to build imagination that develops and takes on a new shape. So, fairy tales basically gives us a moral or a common sense message. For example, in the amongst those various stories that the mother tried to read out to her children, we have, let's take an example of Little Red Riding Hood. From the story Little Red Riding Hood, we receive a message. We receive a moral message. Do not talk to strangers. It also, so like this story, there are so many stories. In fact, all the stories, it provides us moral lessons to be good and to do good, which the mother's children, which all these children in the story educating mother, they failed to do so, for they were not able to bring about balance between imagination and reality. So with this, we end the story.